Ende dieser Erde, ich stets mal noch zum Hungern zwingt.
So I thought I'd make this short video for you, almost as a bonus I suppose, and to explain my personal story of how I slowly went from a sheltered kid to full-on anarchist, since so many people seem shocked by the idea that this is a relatively common trajectory for many young people nowadays, and to give my example as a case study.
Das Recht, die Glut im Krater Herde, nun mit Macht zum Durchbruch dringt.
Like many people, I grew up sharing my parents' values of hard work, meritocracy, and working your way up the ladder as my dad did. But, and there is a theme here, I slowly started to come to the realization that the world was not built for people like me. I began to notice that with everything I tried, I was just a little bit worse than most other people. I was smart and creative and compassionate, but I struggled to make human connections. I was objectively terrible at sports, I was clumsy, awkward, and the prototypical loser. I struggled with things that other kids didn't even have to think about. I had to put my all, my driving force behind forcing myself to conform, to fit in, and to achieve. Of course, I was relentlessly bullied, reduced to tears almost every single night, and made to feel worthless because I didn't have the skills or attributes that were valued by my classmates. Explaining that it was because of my disability didn't help. Along with my lack of siblings, I'm an only child, this left me feeling isolated, alone, and shut out from the world. It felt unfair. Here I was, a kind, compassionate, smart kid. I got good grades, I cared deeply about other people, and I had no one. I realised at this point I was on a knife edge. I could have fallen down one way, gone full incel, nice guy, I'm a nice person so I deserve intimacy, or I could have gone the other way and tried to make the world a better place.
Einen Tisch macht mit den Bedrängern, hier der Sklaven, wach herauf.
This didn't really change until I started university, and once I did, the sad, lonely kid I had been was given space to grow, to make friends, to be his own person. I won't really talk much about university because it was mostly just drinking, partying, avoiding studying and so on, but a couple of things I will touch on. 1. I started to flirt with Edgelord right-wing or anti-SJW rhetoric, found shock humour the pinnacle of comedy, and was just outright insufferable, though luckily I was brought to my senses by my girlfriend at the time, and I started to realise that a couple of my friends, who had ventured much further down that path than I had become genuinely awful and actively unpleasant people due to their politics, much of which I actively agreed with, so I slowly started to be deprogrammed, at least on social issues and inclusivity, though I had very little class consciousness. I took my first couple of steps into the world of work in order to get some extra beer money essentially, by working part-time in a sandwich store on nights. I was exploited and hated it, but at the time I thought it was just because I had a bad job, and once I graduated I could just get a good job and stop worrying about it. The thing I find endlessly fascinating is this idea, this concept of universities turning kids into leftists and they'll change their minds when they're in the real world, because honestly that whole idea is antithetical to my experience. I was the furthest right-wing I've ever been in university, and the furthest left-wing now, after having been in work for the past 6 years. See, when I was in uni, I was sheltered from the world. I didn't have to deal with much of the realities of capitalism. My rent was paid via my student loans, my time was pretty much always spent going to lectures or in the pub, and if I didn't want to go to lectures I didn't have to, so long as I kept my attendance above a certain level and got the grades.
Ein Nichts zu sein, Tag ist nicht länger, alles zu werden strömt zuhauf.
It was only when I entered the world of work full-time, had to support myself and my wages, and fully participate in our exploitative economic system that I really started to realise how fucked up it was, and the true horror of having to face up to the fact that this was my life now, from ages 21 until retirement or death. It was terrifying to me. I went full-time at the sandwich shop. They made me store supervisor, which as I mentioned in a previous video, meant I was left alone to open up and operate the store for hours on end, completely legally, and regularly got into arguments with the franchisee or my line manager over the fact that I was unable to keep up with the standards set for me, or my moral objection to the apparent requirement to change the labels on the produce so it looked like it was in date when it wasn't, leading to multiple threats of unemployment over my refusal to do so. I worked 45 hours a week, received one 20-minute break a day, and I knew I was being exploited and that it was dodgy, but I had to have a job or be homeless. The next major job I had was in a call centre. You can watch my video about it to see just how fucking awful call centres are to work in, so I won't go over it again here, but suffice to say it hammered home to me that it wasn't just dodgy local franchise restaurants, which could fly under the radar due to being small, that were exploitative, but huge multinational banks as well, worth billions, and the injustice hurt a lot. I then tried my hand at working in a bank branch, well, building society technically, but for the purpose of this video it's the same basic thing, which went relatively well until I made a minor admin fuck up. I put one number in the wrong box on a form a few weeks in, and in order to preserve her fragile reputation and ego, my manager essentially treated me like shit and attempted to have me fired for making her look bad. In fact, I'd only been with the company for a few weeks and had been sent to an unfamiliar environment with no support so that my manager could curry favour with her boss, to which I responded by raising a grievance against her. The grievance took months to complete, and at the end of it, the regional manager called me a liar, didn't understand even the most fundamental details of the case, and basically made it clear that I, a disabled employee of 6 months, was a lower priority and much more replaceable than a senior manager of over 30 years. So I had a choice, to either go back to working with my abusive manager or to quit. So, not having much of a choice, I quit. This caused a long period of depression. Previous to this, I had been aware of the massive power disparity between worker and boss, but I had thought that with the help of a union, and the union I was with at the time was really quite powerful within the company, that justice and fairness would prevail. This was a huge shock to the system. If justice didn't exist, what was even the point of trusting in and appealing to authority or the system? If the system enables this injustice to not only prevail, but go all the way up to the highest management, to in fact be the system, that's a system that deserves no respect. It was in this stage, desperate for money, unable to cover outgoings, universal credit, unwilling or unable to cover my rent, never mind my bills or living costs, with a partner who was too sick to be able to work, that I for the first time in my life had to come to terms with the real life consequences of finding myself on the lowest rung of society. I was faced with homelessness, unable to afford pay for my relatively expensive city centre flat, where I had proposed to my then fiancée and made some of the best memories I've ever had. It was my first time having my own place with a partner, and for the first 18 months we were there, we were mostly happy and comfortable. That, of course, changed. Poverty does that to relationships, as I mentioned in a previous video, and when we went from being happy and comfortable in our quite big apartment with all this lovely exposed brick to being forced to live in a tiny room in a shared house with 15 other people barely being able to sleep because the walls were thin and people playing music would keep us up late, having no privacy, barely any comfort, etc. It was honestly horrible, and the worst part is that even that was too much for us to be able to handle without help. We had to borrow the deposit for that place and lie to the landlord and pretend that it was just me staying there in order to keep the rent down, because two people existing in the same room would have cost an extra £50 a month, which we couldn't have afforded. The house was a classic case of a slumlord having money to buy 3 massive houses and maximising profits by turning every room into a bedroom and renting them out separately. And of course by making tenants fucking miserable. Eventually I found a temp job, which I had to cycle 5 miles each way up and down hills to get to, on dangerous roads in the pitch black because it was a night shift, until we were able to move into a nicer house, borrowing money again in order to do so. And then I found another permanent job. It was a shitty call centre job that required me to work evenings and weekends, so a few months later I went to work in a different call centre when an old friend was already working, and this is where my transformation was completed. See, at this point I'd become jaded, beaten down, made aware that because of my disability my life would likely be a struggle, that the capitalist system was not intended to accommodate someone like me, that work would always be hard for me to succeed in, that all businesses from small local food places to banks were immoral and more than happy to victimise, exploit and hurt their workers if it meant more profits for the franchise and or shareholders. But my last job was when everything that I hated and resented about capitalism previously came together into one solid representation of it all, and was the catalyst for me making my original call centers video. Part of my job was to process invoices for this company, the targets for which, just in my department, which didn't even process the high value invoices, was £500,000 per day. Most of the time we either hit or at least came close to. Considering the amount of people who worked in the company, I worked out that just one day's invoices could give everyone in the company a £3,000 annual pay rise. I pointed this out and got into a huge thing with HR over the low rate of pay, which was at the time below the real living wage, and was basically told, we don't have to pay you a living wage, so we won't. They also refused to make minor adjustments to my workplace pertaining to my disability, which they were legally obliged to do, despite me letting them know months previously, until I told them that if they tried to fire me based on a performance improvement plan I failed due to their negligence when it came to my disability, I would sue them to shit. Eventually they accused me of call avoidance, which in call centres can be anything from taking too long to take a shit to hanging up on customers. Basically it's what they throw at you when they want to get rid of you. Plus of course they threatened to fine me over the video, even though it didn't identify them in any way because of the potential reputational damage, which is quite funny because the original video, which is quite general and not specific, got 150 views in the time it was public, whereas the video I made and added notes specifically telling them to go fuck themselves has over 900. They mistreated me, and honestly, had I been the person I am now at the time I started, I would pretty much have immediately sued them under the Equality Act, but oh well, at least I know for next time. It was because of this job that I joined the IWW, became interested in local leftist groups, got involved in local activism, and became the militant leftist who had to be talked out of buying an angle grinder and going around my town removing the middle armrest from benches so homeless people could sleep on them again by 3 different people. It wasn't some liberal university indoctrination, it was a slow, gradual process of realising the problems and injustices inherent in capitalism through living and working under a capitalist system.
Die Signale aufzumessen gefällt, die Internationale erkennt das Menschenrecht.
So that's me, that's how I became a leftist, and as you can see, it wasn't some single huge momentous shift to produce an ideological change, but simply living in a capitalist system as a person for whom the world was not designed. Over time, I've only gained more and more insight and more resentment towards the system that allows these injustices, and this immense struggle to exist. My story is not a unique one. There's a reason a lot of marginalised people turn towards left-wing politics, because the right wing and the status quo has nothing to offer us but more pain and more struggle, whilst the left actually has ideas and cares about improving the lives of everyone in need, regardless of any other factors. It's the conservatives that criminalise abortions, murder disabled people by denying them benefits and declaring them fit for work, ensure that homelessness doubles by halving funding, and victimise ethnic and racial minorities. The right wing are the ones who overwhelmingly cause the struggle of many of the most vulnerable people in our society, and it's for that reason that the left will always be, and should always be, a safe haven for the marginalised and beaten down. This is why we become leftists.